The rain hit the cemetery like it was trying to wash away all the pain in the world, and the single dad knelt in the mud in front of gray stone, not caring that his knees were soaked through, not caring about anything except the name carved into that rock. He pressed his palm flat against the cold granite, like he could still feel her heartbeat underneath it, and he whispered the same 4 words he whispered every single Sunday. I don't know how. Behind him, 7 years old and holding a wilted dandelion instead of real flowers because that's all they could afford, his daughter stood shivering under a torn umbrella, watching her father fall apart in a way children should never have to watch a parent fall apart. What neither of them knew, what nobody standing in that quiet cemetery could have possibly known, was that a woman worth more money than either of them could count was about to step out of a black car parked at the cemetery gate, and by the end of that day, everything about their lives would be different. The single dad hadn't always been a man who cried in cemeteries. 3 years earlier, he'd been an ordinary husband with an ordinary job at a hardware store, coming home every night to a wife who left the porch light on for him and a little girl who ran to the door screaming daddy's home, like he was the greatest man alive. Then came the diagnosis. Then came 11 months of hospital rooms and prayers that stopped working and a bank account that emptied faster than his hope did. Then came the funeral, and after the funeral, silence. The kind of silence that fills a house and never leaves. Now he worked 2 jobs, one stacking boxes in a warehouse until his shoulder screamed, and one driving for a rideshare app until midnight, just so his daughter could keep her shoes without holes and her backpack without patches. Every Sunday, no matter how exhausted he was, no matter how little sleep he'd gotten, he brought her to this cemetery because he promised his wife he would never let their daughter forget her mother's face, her mother's voice, her mother's love. He just never expected that this particular Sunday, standing in the rain with mud soaking through his only good pair of pants, a stranger would witness the worst moment of his week and decide to do something about it. The black car had stopped because of a flat tire, nothing more dramatic than that. The woman inside, a real estate investor named Diane Whitfield who had built an empire out of nothing but grit and a refusal to quit, stepped out to call for help and found herself staring across a field of gravestones at a man on his knees in the rain, a little girl standing beside him holding a single dandelion like it was the most precious bouquet in the world. Diane had lost her own husband 4 years earlier. She knew that posture. She knew that kind of grief because she'd worn it herself, and something in her chest tightened so hard she forgot about the flat tire completely. She walked toward them without thinking, her expensive heels sinking into the wet grass. And when she got close enough, she didn't say anything grand or rehearsed. She simply knelt down next to the little girl and said, "That's a beautiful flower you picked for your mom." The little girl looked up, surprised that a stranger dressed so nicely would kneel in the mud beside her, and said quietly, "It's the only kind I could find." Diane felt something crack open inside her chest. She looked at the single dad, who was wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed to be seen like this, and she said the words that would change everything. "Would you let me bring flowers next Sunday? Real ones. For her." He almost said no. Pride is a strange thing, especially for a man who has spent 3 years refusing help from anyone, terrified that accepting kindness meant admitting he couldn't take care of his own family. But something in Diane's eyes wasn't pity. It was recognition. It was one grieving person looking at another and saying, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." So instead of refusing, he just nodded, too tired and too raw to argue. The next Sunday, Diane came back. She brought white lilies, the kind his wife used to grow in a pot on their old apartment balcony. Though Diane had no way of knowing that detail, she just felt drawn to them. The single dad stood frozen when he saw them, because lilies were his wife's favorite flower, and for a moment it felt like a message from somewhere far away. His daughter, meanwhile, had already grabbed Diane's hand and was showing her which spots on the grass had the softest clovers, chattering the way children do when they finally feel safe enough to be children again. Weeks passed. Diane kept showing up, not because she felt sorry for them, but because something about their small, broken family reminded her of the family she used to have before cancer took her husband too. She started asking questions. Careful questions, gentle questions. How are you managing 2 jobs and a 7-year-old? When's the last time you slept a full night? Does she have someone to help with homework while you're driving until midnight? The single dad answered honestly, mostly because he was too exhausted to build his usual walls. And somewhere along those Sunday conversations, in a cemetery of all places, a friendship began growing between two people who understood loss in a way most people never have to learn. Then came the twist nobody saw coming. One Sunday, Diane didn't bring flowers. Instead, she brought a folder. The single dad's stomach dropped because folders usually meant bad news, bills, eviction notices, something. But Diane sat down on the wet bench beside him and said, I own a property management company. I have a position open, daytime hours only, benefits, enough salary that you could quit the night job and actually tuck your daughter into bed every night instead of driving strangers around the city. He stared at her, waiting for the catch, because in his experience, there was always a catch. Why would you do this for us? He asked, his voice cracking in a way he hadn't allowed it to crack in years. Diane looked at the gravestone beside them, then at the little girl who was already asleep against her father's arm, worn out from a long week of being brave. Because 4 years ago, she said softly, nobody stopped for me. I remember what that loneliness felt like. I promised myself if I ever saw someone drowning in it, I wouldn't just walk past. He took the job, not because he wanted charity, but because Diane made it clear this wasn't charity. This was an opportunity, the same opportunity she would have offered anyone qualified. And he was qualified. He worked harder than anyone on that team, showing up early, staying focused, determined to prove that the kindness given to him hadn't been wasted. Within 6 months, he was managing 3 properties. Within a year, his daughter had new shoes without anyone scraping together spare change, a bedroom with actual curtains instead of a bedsheet taped over the window, and most importantly, a father who was home every single night to read her a bedtime story instead of driving strangers through the dark. But the real twist, the one that made grown men and women watching this story cry, came almost 2 years after that first rainy Sunday. Diane had continued visiting the cemetery, not out of obligation anymore, but because she genuinely loved the little girl who called her the Flower Lady, and because somewhere along the way, she and the single dad had stopped being strangers connected by grief and started becoming something neither of them expected to feel again. Neither of them said it out loud for months. They were both terrified of betraying the people they'd lost. But grief, real grief, doesn't ask you to stop living. It asks you to carry love forward, not bury it beside the ones you lost. One Sunday, standing at the grave with fresh lilies in her hands, Diane finally said what she'd been holding back. I'm not trying to replace her, she said quietly, looking at the gravestone. I could never do that, but I'd like to build something new, if you'll let me. Something that honors her by being good to the daughter she loved so much. The single dad didn't answer with words. He simply reached over and took Diane's hand, right there in the cemetery, right in front of the woman he'd loved and lost, and somehow, impossibly, it felt like permission instead of betrayal. 2 years later, that same little girl, now 9 years old, stood at the front of a small backyard wedding wearing a white dress covered in dandelions she'd picked herself, because dandelions weren't just weeds to her anymore. They were the flowers that started everything. The single dad stood at the altar, no longer collapsing under grief, but standing tall, steady, whole in a way he hadn't been in years. And when the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, the little girl shouted from the front row, I don't object. I picked the flowers. And the whole yard erupted into laughter and tears at the same time. The single dad never forgot his first wife. He visited her grave every single week for the rest of his life, sometimes with Diane, sometimes with his daughter, sometimes alone. But he learned something that day in the rain that he carried with him forever, that grief and hope aren't enemies. Sometimes the person who saves you isn't trying to replace what you lost. Sometimes they're just someone brave enough to kneel down in the mud beside you and remind you that you're not alone in the rain. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment to share your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wings of Kindness for more inspiring stories. Remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life forever.